about me. But here's a little bit about how I'm here. I was a special education teacher. The lights are flickering in here, and so that might cause me to lose my train of thought every once in a while. I'll just laugh it off. Okay, I was a special education teacher for almost 20 years. I did about 15 years at the Steamboat High School. 5 years we were in South America when I was teaching at a school there. And I really specialized in working with kids who had ADHD and autism. That was kind of my specialty. Those were the ones that I really connected with. And yeah, so I did that. When we returned from South America, we decided not to go back into teaching for me. And I realized there's this growing number of adults who are finding out after high school as adults that they have ADHD and or autism. And I thought, well, this is something I know a lot about. I've been doing this for a really long time. Maybe the adults would like to learn these strategies that they didn't learn when they were in high school. So I started coaching. And I do that still. It's going really well. I enjoy it. But also, I was thinking part of my work as a teacher was to support the adults around the kids. And so it was my job to help teachers, administrators, parents understand the different ways that these kids think, they learn, they communicate, they solve problems, so that they could create an environment where those kids could be successful. Then I realized those kids are now in their late 30s and they're in the workplace, and it will probably benefit businesses and organizations to better understand neurodiversity. And so this is where the consulting part comes in. That's why I'm here with you today. It is something that if you start to research this, you'll see is starting to gain momentum as far as businesses embracing this kind of thinking. So let's see, check my notes. Okay, here we go. So some background vocabulary for those of you who are new to this. Neurodiversity is diversity in how our brains work. And so I think we can all understand that in the room, in our space, in our teams, people have strengths, people have weaknesses, they support each other. This is how neurodiversity works. Neurodivergent is someone whose brain wiring gives them strengths and struggles different from what we consider to be typical. So if you think about your own personal weaknesses, you know what those are. And unless you're neurodivergent, it kind of falls in the average range. Someone who's neurodivergent, if you could imagine, their challenges are amplified to a level that it really significantly impacts them day to day. It impacts them at home, it impacts them in their personal life, it impacts them at work. Someone who's neurotypical is not neurodivergent. So the majority of us are neurotypical. A neurotype is a specific type of neurodivergence, and we're going to get into a few of these in just a minute. Okay, here's what we're going to do in our time together today. We will talk about why neurodiversity matters. We'll talk about the characteristics of some specific neurotypes. We'll talk about what spiky profiles are and the benefits of neurodivergent thinking. And the goal here is that you'll leave with a couple of easy strategies that you're ready to try. Our goals in this very short time we're here together, you will not be able to make big changes to how you do things. That would require a different kind of programming where we spend more time reflecting and trying things and learning new strategies. Today, all I want are your big ideas. So the ahas. Oh, I've never really thought about that before. Or, oh, okay, I've seen that before, and now it makes a little more sense. And so for those of you who are here, or even if you're online, I'd love you to share those. So you can write them on the sticky notes if you're here online. If you want to just like post those in the chat, those are really helpful for me to know what resonated with you. Okay. So why neurodiversity matters to you? It is a very well-respected statistic that 20% of our population is neurodivergent. That's 1 out of every 5 people. So you can think about how many people we've got attending this seminar right now. I would imagine your teams likely have more than 5 people on them. You are encountering neurodiversity every day. And it's very possible you don't know who they are. And it's also possible they don't know who they are. So they can't even tell you because they don't know this about their brains. I have a coaching client right now who's in his 70s, just now finding out that he's neurodivergent and getting coaching. There are some organizations in the US who are really embracing. That are embracing neurodiversity, and of course they're like collecting data. How are these programs working? And they're finding some pretty cool results. Teams with neurodivergent professionals can be 30% more productive than those without. JP Morgan Chase has an autism at work program, so they are actively recruiting autistic talent, and they've got programs in place to support them and mentor them. And what they have found is that those employees are 48% faster and 92% more productive. 92% more productive. And when we're going to dip our toes in and learn a tiny little bit about autism, and when we touch on that, you'll be able to see that it's due to the way that their brains are wired that they can do this. Companies that are embracing neurodiversity are seeing boosts in engagement, performance, and profits. Okay, so this is a good thing that you guys are participating in this and learning about this. However, unemployment for neurodivergent adults runs at least as high as 30 to 40%, 3 times the rate for people without disabilities. I had a client once, she's autistic, and she's like this high-level executive assistant. She had to manage these complex systems and schedules and international travel and preferences and just like this whole thing. And when she was describing to me her systems for how she did this, my mind was like blown away. Like I couldn't even comprehend it. But for whatever reason, like that branch closed, I don't know. She lost her job and she was currently applying and interviewing for them. And she was unable to explain these complex systems in an interview. And like all these businesses were missing out on her brilliant brain because they just kind of dismiss her. And so we worked together for a while, and eventually she stumbled onto a business that specializes in hiring neurodivergent people or is really open to it, and they snapped her up. Everybody else missed her. She's part of this 30 to 40% that's unemployed. And when they are employed, really only half of them feel like they're in a place where they're comfortable and that they can speak openly about being neurodivergent. So there's definitely room for improvement here. So how are we doing with the flickering? Everybody doing okay? Do we feel like we're in a disco or a nightclub? Does anybody want to dance? All right, we're just gonna go with it. Okay, before we dip into the common neurotypes, I do want to say that what we're going to talk about here is very surface level. You're just going to get like some of the highlights of what it's like to have these different neurotypes. And I also want to be clear that it is not our job to diagnose anyone. I was working with a large copper mining company, and their first question is, how do we diagnose these people? And the answer is we don't. What we're going to do is we're going to learn some of the common characteristics. We're going to learn a couple strategies. And remember, our job here is just to be like, oh, interesting. I hadn't really thought about that before. So really surface level, big ideas. So I read a thing recently that said there are maybe hundreds of different neurotypes. Some of them, of course, are much more common. Some of them are much less common. Some of them are a little bit more obvious and visible. Perhaps you know someone or can recognize someone who has Down syndrome or someone who has cerebral palsy. But actually, those are very rare. The ones that are the most common, the top 3, are dyslexia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, and autism. And a lot of people actually call those hidden disabilities because they're much less obvious. They're not so easy to see. Some other neurotypes include, and maybe you've heard of these, maybe you haven't, but there's dyscalculia, dysgraphia, Tourette syndrome, sensory processing disorder, mental health conditions, executive functioning is something that people are starting to talk about a little bit more, and just there's so many more. This is not like a medical diagnosis of having neurodiversity. Each of these has its own medical diagnosis, so there's some flexibility into what people think falls into here. But we're going to talk about the top three just briefly. So we'll start with dyslexia. Dyslexia affects reading, spelling, and writing. This is our most common neurotype. People who have dyslexia may have challenges making sense of complex written instructions. If you do not have dyslexia, you are able to read fluently. And when you read, you don't even think about reading. You're forming a picture in your mind of the set of directions or the story that you're reading. It just kind of flows. Imagine that if you have dyslexia and each word that you're reading requires you to think. I have to think about this word, and then this word, and then this word. You're not going to be able to form that easy picture in your brain. So the longer the writing, the longer the content, the harder it is to make sense of it all. Sometimes they will have difficulty finding the right word to say. So it's not always just about reading and writing. Communicating their thoughts through writing and speaking can be a challenge. So it's in here. How do I get it out in a way that makes sense through speaking and through writing? So here's what I want to do. I want to pause for just a second, and I want you all to think about, in my department, what kind of challenges might someone who's dyslexic encounter on a daily basis? You can think it, write it, share it, whatever, but I'm just going to not talk for a minute. Okay. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD. There's a lot of discussion in the ADHD world that this is actually a pretty terrible name. It's completely inaccurate. If we start with the first two words, attention deficit, it is actually not a deficit of attention. It is an overabundance of attention. There's so much information that's coming in, and they don't necessarily have the ability to sort it out and to stay focused. And so that whole idea of something comes in and somebody says squirrel, right? That they're pulled away immediately. That's that. It's like it's all coming in all the time. That's what leads to our number one characteristic of distractibility, is that it's coming in and it takes their attention immediately. People who have ADHD may have difficulty getting started on tasks. It looks like procrastination, but it's actually just this initial inertia to get started requires more effort and energy than someone who's neurotypical. Hyperactivity. Okay, hyperactivity can look physical. It can be outwardly obvious. These are the people who love to move. They're constantly bouncing around with ideas. Maybe their leg is bouncing. They're constantly fidgeting with something. It's also internal. And this is actually why we diagnose girls less than boys with ADHD, because my clients talk about there's so much noise in their brain. There's a lot of bouncing around of ideas here, 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 here. And it might kind of say something kind of random. And you're like, where did that come from? What came from all that internal chaos that's going on in their brains? Time management, planning, and follow through. So the ability, they know what they need to do, but it's hard to break it into its steps, assign a time to each of those steps, and follow through without getting distracted. So they may need support with that. Attention to detail. These are big ideas, people, but being able to see the steps and make sure that nothing is being missed. That can be hard for someone who has ADHD. Sensory regulation. So again, so much information coming in through our senses. So maybe there's a little bit of a breeze that's coming in, or the flickering of the lights would probably really aggravate somebody who's